How you doing today? Good to see you. Thanks for coming to the broadcast today. I hope you're doing well. I'm live streaming from my office here at South Campus. It's a rainy day. Looks like we're going to have rain on and off today. You know, rain's always a great thing for school because when it's beautiful outside, it's hard to sit down and do your homework. But on those rainy, crappy days, it's a great day for doing schoolwork. So I'm glad to see that you've decided to join me. I notice we've got Johanna in the classroom. I'm sure we probably have Dimitro, maybe Caleb here as well. Don't know who else is in the chat box. But whoever you are, feel free to type in and say hello. Notice we got Matt Morita. Thanks, Matt. Good to see you. Dimitro, good to see you. Well, it's the same characters as usual. My crazy band of hardcore students. Always good to see you folks. Thanks for coming. I really, really appreciate your dedication and your motivation each and every day. Do y'all have any questions so far this week? Any questions for me before we get started? You know, tonight is webinar night. We're going to meet at 8 p.m. like we always do and have a discussion for a half an hour or so. I do hope you folks can make it to the webinar tonight. I know probably Matt, Johanna, and Noda, you are typically my part of my audience, so I hope you can attend like you usually do. It's always good to see you. So today we're talk to you a little bit. Okay, I noticed that we're bouncing on and off. I'm not sure what's going wrong with. Oh, bummer. Oh, that sucks. I'm sorry, Matt. Hopefully we'll see you next week. It's always a bummer when you don't make it because I do love having you. But hopefully whatever you're doing is cool and fun tonight. But we will miss you. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, marriage, a legally and socially sanctioned union of sexually intimate adults. Traditionally, it's also included economic interdependence, common residence, sexual fidelity, shared responsibility for children. How many of you, we have 4 people in the audience, how many of you would like to be married? I'm just curious, how many of you are for marriage and how many of you are not interested in marriage? Let's go ahead and do a quick survey out there. If you could get married, would you, or is that something, or would you rather cohabitate without being married? What's your preference? Matthew would like to get married. Okay, fantastic. Just curious. If you get married, would you open up a one checking account, shared checking account, or keep separate checking accounts? If you got married, would you keep separate checking accounts or would you have one checking account and one pot of money? I'd be curious. Looks like we have a couple of people typing in the chat bar, so I'll just wait a moment. Okay. When I was a high school kid back in the 80s, for us, the goal was to get out of high school, go to college, get your degree, and then find a spouse and get married. It was a reflexive behavior for me. I never asked the question, do I want to get married? Do I not want to get married? We didn't do that. It was just a stinking reflex, right? And so I would share, but you would also have your own account. Very good. Yeah, my wife and I, when we got married, neither one of us had any cash at all. We were both two broke teenagers. So it made sense to put our money in one pot. But I do understand there are people, especially people who get married after they've grown and already gotten established and they want to keep their own little bit of independence. Johanna says she's married and have a bank account with my husband that we share. Okay. Would you say most people share finances like that, or do most married couples not share finances like that? I'm curious. And I don't know what the advantages and the disadvantages of that are. my wife typically, I don't argue about money. Johanna, since you do share a bank account with your husband, do y'all ever have arguments about how the money should be spent? I'd be curious. So, the following social trends have challenged this idea of traditional marriage. Not as many people are getting married these days as there used to be, and the question is why, right? Back in a long time ago, and I guess even to a certain degree when I was a kid, the idea was you had to get married or something was wrong with you. I'm not saying this is the truth. It is not the truth. But the belief that I grew up with was that if you were not married, something was wrong with you. However, that attitude is changing in America, and suddenly it seems okay not to be married. But I remember there was a time when you had to, or something was wrong with you. All right. Back in there you go. Dimitro's happily married. Good for you. Fantastic. When I was a kid, moving in with somebody with whom you were not married was actually kind of taboo. I remember, don't tell my wife's parents, but we moved in before we got married. And whenever she was living in Boone at the time, going to ASU, Appalachian State, and we lived together. But whenever her parents would come to visit, I would have to go stay at a friend's house for the weekend because cohabitation, being married, living together without being married, was taboo in my culture back in the 80s. But you know what? Cohabitation's not that big a deal anymore. So these attitudes towards the need to pair up, to get married, and to only live with somebody after you were married, those kinds of things were the norm in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Not as much now these days. Your book's going to talk about this reduced premium on permanence. When I got married, the idea is that you get married forever, for better or for worse. But people these days are, because being single is okay, because being divorced has lost its taboo status, people are less likely to remain in a marriage that doesn't fulfill each and every one of their needs. Does your partner for life fulfill every need? Do they fulfill you sexually? Do they fulfill you emotionally? Do they fulfill you entertainment-wise? Do they have the values that you want? People these days are now looking for a perfect soulmate. In fact, your book even talks about the all or nothing marriage. One of my friends from graduate school wrote that book, and he argues that today people are getting married and expecting that their marriage partner fulfill every stinking need that they have, and that people are unwilling to stay with somebody who doesn't fulfill every need of their life. Good morning, Evalis. Good to see you. And Dimitro says he's happily married and they have one bank account and don't argue. Wow, listen to us being conventional people. So, it's okay to be single now. It's okay to live with somebody that you're not married with. And you know what? It's okay to be divorced, so people are willing to leave a marriage that's not completely perfect, right? And you know what? We do have these transition in gender roles. So now it's no longer the idea that a woman is supposed to graduate from high school and then find somebody to marry her and settle down and have children. In fact, if you look at this graph that I have underneath you, you'll notice that there is an incredible change in the amount of women in the workforce. Now, you folks think, oh, that's crazy. Everybody works, but it wasn't always the norm. And when I grew up as a kid in the 70s, lots of women were motivated to become housewives and to stay at the house. And there wasn't such a strong motivation to for a woman to get a job. It was more socially acceptable. It was desirable for women to stay home and, quote, raise families. I can promise you that belief, that motivation is all but gone now. And if you look at this graph right here, you're going to see that more females are in the workforce than at any time in the last 100 or so years, right? And you know what? It's okay to not have children these days. Again, a belief that I would have found crazy 25 years ago, when in the 80s, if you got married and did not have kids, people whispered about you. They thought that you couldn't have kids because everybody has kids if they can. But now people are voluntarily childless. And then you know what? I now have folks that are living in plural relationships where it'll be 2 women living with 1 man, 2 men living with 1 woman. People that this idea of the nuclear family with a mom, a dad, and 2 kids and a dog, that's just not the norm anymore. So what you're going to see, and people will maybe shake their heads and say, oh, that's the end of the world. But there are definitely ways in which people are living now that do not represent this old style belief that we should all graduate high school, pair bond, and have children. Those attitudes are just changing. Now, having said that, I noticed that Johanna, Dimitro, and me, all 3 of us are living what you might call the prototypical married pattern. We found a partner, we got married, we opened a joint bank account, and we're sort of all for one. But you know what? That's not really everybody's reality these days. People are definitely making different choices. Now, what are some cultural influences on marriage? So, Demetra, did your parents like the woman you married? Did they have any input on the person you married? Johanna, did you have to get approval from your parents to marry the gentleman or the person that you married? How many of you had to get your parents' approval to get married? Do any of you know anyone who is in an arranged marriage? I know 2 different people who are in arranged marriages, right? Now, most of us think that we choose who we get married, but you know what? That's not a universal. So around 80% of the world cultures practice some sort of arranged marriage. And they place the priority on the family rather than the individual's welfare during the mate selection process. I remember, good morning, Johanna. No, you did not have to get your parents' approval. Okay, some people do. In fact, I had a friend in graduate school from Turkey, and I remember after our 2nd year of graduate school, my friend told me that he was going back to Turkey for the summer to get married. And I was like, holy cow, man, I didn't even know you had a girlfriend. He's like, I didn't. This is an arranged marriage. This woman has been selected for me. And my friend, who was in grad school, a college-educated, wealthy guy, was going back to Turkey to get married in an arranged marriage. He had no choice. His parents made that deal for him. Now, he seemed incredibly happy, and he and his wife really got along in their traditional marriage. But lo and behold, he didn't decide who he got married to. I have another friend who also belongs to the FLDS sect, a very extreme sect in the Mormon religion. Actually, they're not even considered Mormons anymore. And she was given her husband. She actually is the 2nd wife to a gentleman. Not legal. You're not allowed to legally get married twice here, to be married to 2 people here in the U.S. But she is, quote, married and the 2nd wife of an FLDS man. And some of these people in the FLDS have multiple marriages, and these females are assigned to males as marriage partners. Now, the crazy thing is, you might say that's a horrible, horrible idea, and in some situations maybe it is. But one of the things that I found was that these people that I've known that were in arranged marriages don't seem all that unhappy. How crazy is that? And in fact, your book, if you read in your book, they're going to suggest to you that they've done research on Indian couples in arranged marriages living in the United States. And you know what you're going to find? These people report higher satisfaction than U.S. couples who have what we call marriages based on choice and love, right? And you know what? Worldwide divorce rate for arranged marriages is very low compared to choice-based marriages. Now, you might say, hold on, Chris. Arranged marriages are probably way more conventional and way more rule-based and culture-based, and maybe divorce isn't acceptable in these very conventional cultures. And this is right, too. But basically, these people who are in arranged marriages do learn how to find love and stay committed to their partners. So even though we marry for love here in the United States, just realize that in a lot of parts of the world, marriages are seen as a contract between families, not so much as a contract between individuals. Oh, there you go. Dimitro's parents liked his choice. Fantastic. I will tell you, one of my boys is cohabitating with a girl he has a live-in, and we do not love her. I love her, I don't mean in a hateful way, but she is not someone we would have chosen. But it's the one our kid went with, so what the hell, what you gonna do, right? Now, your book introduces you to 7 different types of pair bonding. Monogamy, the practice of having only one spouse at a time. Now, I do know people in polygamous relationships. Like I said, I've got some FLDS people who are engaged in polygamous or multiple marriage to multiple people, having more than one spouse at a time. It's practiced in some cultures, and in fact, it is practiced in this very small sect located in Arizona. In Utah, I think it is where my friend Carol lives. And one of the things I will tell you is that Carol is not as happy as she could be in this polygamous marriage. And she's told me that there are some things that she has to go through, and she doesn't feel quite as valued being in this polygamous marriage, right? Now, you've probably heard of monogamy and polygamy, but have you ever heard of endogamy or homogamy? Now, most of us practice endogamy and homogamy without even knowing it. So I measured a Southern Caucasian Baptist female who was had the same level of income and education as me. I married someone in my own social group. Human beings tend to do that. And we tend to marry within our own social groups. In fact, there are sometimes taboos and problems associated with marrying outside of your cultural circle. On the other hand, we talk about homogamy, which is the tendency of people to marry others who have similar personal characteristics, similar in attraction level, similar in education, similar in values, similar in interests. In fact, we mentioned this in close relationships when we were talking about that Monday and Tuesday. And it turns out that people who marry these similar others do tend to have longer lasting and more satisfying marital relationships. Now, it sounds like most of us in here are monogamous, but remember, there are people who engage in plural marriages, polygamy. And one of the things you don't know about that you probably do unconsciously is this idea of marrying in your own social circle and marrying people who have similar qualities to you, endogamy and homogamy. Now, again, your book is going to revisit the same chart that I talked about a couple of days ago, this idea that men and women seem to have different patterns in choosing their mates. So women seem to place more value on a potential partner's socioeconomic status, his intelligence, ambition, and financial projects. Sometimes we think of women as, when we use the negative term gold digger, but basically they're interested in values that are going to help them support children that they may have, whereas they suggest that men in general, when you ask them, they seem to place more value on youthfulness and physical attractiveness of the mate. So we do seem to have these gender differences when people decide to pair off permanently. And again, you can go back to the chart from chapter 9 where we talked about this evolutionary approach to attractiveness and mate selection. Now, marriage rates hover at about, divorce rates hover at about 40%. Okay, it doesn't say, I forget what chart I've got that on. Divorce rates seem to hover right around 40%. There was a time when divorce rates were skyrocketing. People thought that, wow, and almost 50% of divorces marriages ended in divorce. That sort of tapered off a little bit, but about 40% of all marriages are going to end in divorce. Not everybody's marriage is going to last. What are some of the factors that are going to predict whether or not your divorce, your marriage is going to last? So what are some of the characteristics? Did you know that people whose parents were divorced are more likely to get divorced themselves? Maybe it's because they saw it as a viable option and they see how the process works. So you're going to notice that people who have parents who were divorced are more likely to get divorced themselves. If you look at this chart right underneath here, what you're going to notice is that people are getting married at later and later ages. That's actually a good thing. Did you know that people who get married earlier are more likely to get divorced than people who wait until they get married? My wife was 21 and I was 24 when we got married. And if you look at that in 1991, we were a little young for our group. The average age of marriage in 1990 was 26 for males, and it looked to be 24 for females. I was 24 and my wife was 21. My dad got married when he was 17. My mom got married when she was 17. They both got married because they were involved in pregnancies in high school. You know what? That was quite common in high school. People would graduate and get married at 17 or 18 or 19 years of age. Those marriages tended, both my mom and my dad got divorced before they met each other, got married, and had me. And so people who get married earlier are more likely to get divorced. And you know, that's the crazy thing. You change so much from the time you're 18 to 25 that if you pair off and get married at 18, 19, or 20, sometimes you wind up being married to a person that you don't know. Just out of curiosity, Johanna and Dimitro, how old were y'all when you got married? And if you don't want to say, that's completely fine, but I just think it's kind of interesting. My older brothers who came of age in the early 70s all got married before they were 20, and almost every one of them got divorced as well. Now, you know what? My wife and I dated for 4 years before we, was it 4 years, 20 to 20? Yeah, for 4 years before we got married. Research suggests that the longer you court somebody, you date somebody before you get married, the less likely you are to get divorced. The idea being probably that you get to find out all the qualities of the person and decide whether or not you like them or don't like them. All right. There are personality qualities that tend to be associated with divorce. People who are perfectionists or who have high degrees of insecurity are more likely to get divorced than people who are not quite such perfectionists and who feel more secure in themselves. The quality of premarital communication. The crazy thing is you can listen to people talk to one another, and depending upon the way they communicate, you can predict how likely they are to get divorced. We're going to talk about that in probably one or two slides, so we'll revisit that in just a section. And in fact, and we're going to talk about these, negativity, sarcasm, being insulting to your partners, and being unsupportive. All of these things that seem problematic in your dating partner will absolutely kill your marriage. Johanna was 18 when she got married. Oh, okay, that's pretty young. Good for you, Johanna, still in there and fighting. We all fall in love when we were in our teenage years, and I probably would have gotten married that young too, except my high school sweetheart got tired of me and left my sorry tale. But I could have seen myself doing that. Okay, notice sex and his wife was 25. Dimitro, as young as you look, you were probably still young for your age group. I'm not sure what year y'all got married, 2000, 2010. But even then, y'all would have been a little bit young for people getting married. And so all of these things, if your parents are divorced, if you get married young, if you don't date the person for a long time, if you're sort of an insecure personality, if y'all argue a lot, these are all things that are going to tell us how likely you are to get divorced. Now, your book then goes through and talks about, I'm going to go ahead and do it this way. I wanted to put this whole chart in here for you to look at. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking specifically about this one chart. And so this chart is used to describe a model developed by Carter and McGoldrick called the family life cycle. If you, one of the things that you are going to notice as you grow up and mature is that you go through this weird, life is all about these different cycles that we have. And so Carter and McGoldrick suggest that human beings, as we become adults, we have sort of, and begin to go out and search for our adult family, we go through sort of 6 phases they call the family life stage. Okay, there's this period when we leave our nuclear family at home and move out. We are between families. That's where you are single, and you're your parents' child, but for the first time you are yourself, right? Does everybody remember moving out of the first house the first time you went to college? You moved out and got an apartment with a friend, and you were truly on your own. You kind of felt like you knew you had a family, but there was sort of that weird period where you're all alone by yourself. That's sort of the between families life stage. Okay, then we find a new family, we pair bond, and that's the joining of 2 families. That's when you meet that person, you introduce her to your family, she introduces you to her family. You go on some picnics, you do that Christmas dinner, that Thanksgiving dinner, that Easter dinner, that July 4th dinner, and you have to start integrating your 2 families, right? And you have to find out how you're going to interact with those families. The third stage is most, and I'm being stereotypical, and if this is not your family, Dimitro, if this is not your family, Johanna, this is not a judgment on you. This is just a statement of the typical practice that most families go through. Most of the families are then going to have their young children, right? And we go through that period. Then your children are going to grow up and they're going to start to separate from you. And that's a different time, the family with adolescence. And then your children are going to do the same exact thing that you do. They're going to launch out of your house and start searching for their own family. And that's sort of, we sometimes call that the empty nester syndrome. And that's stage 5. And then you begin to become the grandparents. You become the grandparent and you start to appreciate this idea of generational change. And so this represents sort of a transition that Carter and McGoldrick argued that human beings go through as we move through our adult life. Okay? Now, just remember that let's talk briefly about some of these stages. Now, the first one, stage one, between families, the unattached young adult. As it's going to suggest in your book, the average age for marriage has been gradually increasing for several decades. So what that tells us is that this stage one, the between family stage, is becoming longer and longer for most people. And it's probably the result of a lot of factors, including the availability of new career options for women, increased educational requirements, and an increased emphasis on being myself, personal autonomy, and the fact that it's okay to be single. But what you're finding is that this first stage here is much longer now than it ever used to be back in my age, right? Now, here's the deal. The next phase begins when you find whatever romantic partner you're going to find, right? So the weird thing is your book's going to suggest that the joining of families is also often characterized by problems and disagreements. In fact, we're going to show it to you in just a minute. Let's see, I don't know where I have that. Oh, we're going to talk about divorce tomorrow. I'm sorry. I actually will show you a chart tomorrow which shows you that your likelihood of getting divorced is greatest in the first 10 years of your marriage. It goes up incredibly steeply. The likelihood of getting divorced goes up incredibly steeply for the first 3 or 4 years of your married life, and then begins to decrease. And really, the biggest risk for getting divorced appears to be the first 10 years of marriage. I would say, and your book talks about this, this is because when people do finally get married, you've got to do this joining of families, these joining of customs, these joining of rituals. You've got to figure out who's going to wash the clothes, who's going to cook the dinner. There are all kinds of sort of, if you will, points of negotiation that have to occur during the first year of life. In fact, what your book's going to suggest, 8 to 14% of newlyweds score in the distressed range. Almost 10% of newlyweds start off marriage already in a distressed marriage. Now, we sometimes also call this as the honeymoon phase 2, right? And, honestly, research suggests that having kids decreases life satisfaction. So although there is the friction of joining the two families together, you don't have the pressure of kids yet. That's sort of phase 2. Right? Now, couples who choose to remain childless cite the great cost incurred in raising children. Just out of curiosity, Dimitro, are y'all interested in having kids? If so, why or why not? And Johanna, I forgot. I'm not sure if y'all have kids or not. Are you interested in having kids? And if so, why or why not? I'd be curious in hearing that. Most couples decide to have children, but there are increasing numbers of people who have decided that children maybe is not the way that they want to go. All right, stage 3, the family with young children. This represents another huge transition. Again, what we're having to do is to renegotiate roles. Dimitro has a 10-year-old daughter. Oh, wow, okay, so very good. And so just like you have to renegotiate roles when you get married with a partner, when you bring a child into the house, that's a new roommate in a sense. And what you're having to do is you have to renegotiate the roles and routines of your relationship again. This transition to parenthood, of course, it tends to be a little bit more difficult on moms than it does dads. Unfortunately, in this culture, a lot of the child rearing, a lot of the domestic stuff is still more on the shoulders of females than it is on males in our culture. And so this transition to parenthood, your book's going to suggest, has a larger impact on females than males. And in fact, what they suggest is that almost 20% of new moms will report postpartum depression syndromes, including high stress levels, marital dissatisfaction, and just general sadness, right? Now, why do females have this? Is this because of in modern society we don't have the supports like we used to have? One of the cool things about being married and having kids for me is that my mom and dad were very, very close, and they provided the support that my wife and I needed as new parents. Some people suggest that this postpartum depression that we see exploding in the world now might be sort of what you might call a modern civilization disorder. Now, they talk about the transition to parenthood, and they say it's even more difficult when the female's expectations are not met. Dimitro, you have kids. Johanna, you have kids. I have kids. I can tell you, when you have children, there is a lot of extra work that now comes on the table. There's a lot of stress. And what your book's going to suggest is that this transition is more difficult when the father is not as involved as he could or should be. And what I do notice in some of my less happy relationship patterns, partner friends, is that some of the guys don't participate as much as they should in being a father. And so it's very important that the dads sort of join in that. A review of research has shown this, though. If you survey people's level of satisfaction, one of the things you're going to find is that people are just a little bit less happy when they have children. There are wonderful things about having kids. There are sublime moments of beauty and that you just cannot imagine. But the day-to-day drudgery of taking care of kids is difficult, and it shows in survey data. What you're going to find is parents exhibit lower marital satisfaction than comparable non-parents, and mothers of infants report the steepest decline in marital satisfaction. And the more kids people have, the less marital satisfaction they show. Having kids definitely puts a strain on relationships. So, as I'm going to suggest to you tomorrow, marriage peaks in the first 10 years of life. Divorce peaks during the first 10 years of marriage. You're more likely to get divorced in the first 10 years of your marriage. Why, you might ask? Well, number 2, the joining of families through marriage. In stage 2, you're having to change your roles and incorporate the new person's family and their behavior patterns. And then as soon as you get that done, most people are going to have children within the first 5 or 6 years of your life, which is going to add to the family stress. So the reason that divorce is so much more likely in the first 10 years of your life, it's because you're going through these amazing transitions where you're incorporating another person and then more people in the form of children into your life. And this is a stressful time. Now, the question is not so much whether parents are happier than non-parents, but under what circumstances can parents experience the most well-being. And they found that parents who really place meaning in having children showed increased well-being. Some people have children accidentally. Oops, it happens. And that can be difficult on those parents. And those parents may be the ones that have the least life satisfaction. But if you're like my wife and I, I'm not sure how you are, Dimitro, and how you are, Johanna, but we planned for our child and we thought about our child and the meaning and what our child represented for us. And so all this extra meaning that my wife and I were able to place in the development of our family and our children really helped us get through the difficulties of the child rearing process. Now, chapter 4, the family then, your kids unfortunately are going to grow up and become adolescents. Let's see. Dimitro has a 10-year-old child. Johanna, your children probably aren't even 10 yet. One of the things that you're going to find is that those kids are going to become teenagers. When they become teenagers, they are going to decide that they don't have to listen to you anymore. They're going to start listening to their friends more than they listen to you. Your children, in fact, are going to start thinking you're a knucklehead because your children are going to think they know more than you. Adolescence was actually one of the more challenging times for me as a parent because I'm used to telling my kids what to do and having them listen to me. My teenage boys, neither one of them wanted to listen to me. And in fact, my younger one started deciding he was going to be a challenging child and test my patience in lots of different ways. How many of you were the testing teenager? How many of you were that kind of kid that gave your parents hell when you were in high school? Did you spend your time sneaking out of the house? Did you argue with your parents about what you were going to wear to school? Did you fight with your students about your curfew? Did you maybe smoke some marijuana or drink some alcohol or smoke a cigarette? Were you one of those kinds of kids? My children decided to challenge me a little bit, just like I was a real pain in the ass to my parents. And your book's going to have a little section where it talks about this period because this does represent a new change in your children because your children finally are starting to move away from you. Parental influence tends to decline while the influence of peer groups tends to increase, right? Now, your parent is going to be important. Your kid's going to still listen to you about school and career, but in terms of how they dress, how they spend their leisure time, things like sex and alcohol, all of these things, they're going to start listening to their peers more than they listen to you. So it's going to be difficult. Now, here's the deal. Most of the arguments, though, in your book is going to say this, and the research supports this out. Most of the arguments are not going to be about serious things like sex and drugs. Really, most of the time, most of the arguments are going to be about staying out late, going to this place or that place, more humdrum deals. So it's going to be stuff like chores, how you dress, what time you come in. Most of the trouble that you're going to have during your teenage years with your kids is not going to be about serious things like pregnancy or drugs or breaking the law. It's going to be on those more routine stuff. And there's only going to be not many children are going to have those really serious conflicts with their parents. So yes, having teenagers is difficult. They are going to stress you out and argue with you. But most of the time, if you can relax as a parent, most of the things that you're going to argue about aren't going to be as serious and as bad as you might think. Now, your book also talks about the sandwich generation. This is sort of a relatively new thing. As we move to nuclear families and people have to grow old without the support of having a big extended family around, we're now seeing this weird situation where parents of my age, in my 50s, are having to take care of adolescent children as well as parents who are older and need support. And so your book's going to introduce this thing called the sandwich generation. I exist in the sandwich generation. I don't know if any of you are old enough to be taking care of your parents as well as your children, but if you're having to take care of your parents as well as your children, you exist in what's known as the sandwich generation. I will tell you, after I finish lecture today, I'm going over to my 82-year-old father's house. I do this every day. I go over there. I take him and his 80-year-old wife some lunch. I'll go over there. I'll wash the dishes. I get the mail for them. If my dad needs anything cleaned up or he needs food put in his bird feeder, I'll do that. Sometimes I take him to the doctor. If the car breaks down, I give them money to pick him up. So I'm in the period where I'm taking care of my parents, and at the same time, I'm taking care of, well, actually now they've just moved out of the teenage years, but I was also taking care of them too. And so this adds an extra layer of pressure onto the adolescent period, and your book's going to talk about that. Now, your book then talks about launching children into the adult world, and there is a chart, and I don't think I have this chart. I do not. I do not have this for the chart. But one of the things that your book is going to talk about is the idea of adult children living at home. Boomerang children, they're sometimes called. And there's actually a chart on page 289 of your textbook which talks about the likelihood, the rates of children living at home as an adult. And what you're going to see from this chart is that men are more likely to live at home as adults than are females. That's the one takeaway that you're going to notice from this chart. And number two, what you're going to notice is that more adult children are living at home now than they have in the last 50 years. Now, if you look at this chart, it shows percentage of adult children living at home since 1940. And what you're going to notice is that there were more adult children living at home in the 1940s than there are today. But starting in the 1950s, throughout the 1990s, less adult children were living at home than are living at home now. Your book's going to talk about that a little bit. And one of the things I think most of us will agree on is life is so difficult, is so expensive, and jobs are so hard to find that a lot of children are being forced back into their parents' homes as adults. Okay? Now, if your children are lucky enough to have great jobs and to be able to launch out of the home and achieve their liberation, you become what's known as an empty nester parent. Now, some people think it's difficult to become an empty nester. Your book's going to suggest that that is not necessarily the case. A lot of adults really are quite happy and are able to transition back to the things that really made them have more happiness back in children now that the children are gone. So most parents do adjust effectively to the empty nest situation. And in fact, this stage is generally a positive one for the family. In fact, what they suggest is that parents, it's actually a little more difficult when the children move back into the home after leaving. So not only do the children become liberated, but the adult becomes liberated as well. Now, your book's going to suggest the family in later life. Did you know that marital satisfaction tends to climb in the post-parental period? After your kids leave, your marriage will get better. Again, I don't want to slam on having kids and I don't want you to not have children. But crazily enough, having children and the responsibility that goes with it is difficult and is challenging for people. And so the research actually suggests that people's marriages get better when the kids move out because there's less stress, there's less things to argue about, and the parents can get back to doing the things that they enjoyed doing before the kids came along. And with the cool bonus, you probably have more money during this period than you did as a young kid. Now, your book does say that being done parenting is not a foregone conclusion for this age group because 10% of all children live with a grandparent. So some of you are going to have children who, for one reason or another, will not be able to take care of their children. And so being raised by grandparents or being the grandparent that raises a child is a fairly common thing. I will tell you that although my parents did not raise my children, when my kids, the first 3 years of my life, my parents acted as daycare operators, taking care of both of my boys until my oldest son was 3 and my youngest son was about 18 months old. Then my parents told me they were tired and needed help. But you are going to find yourself in stage 6, even doing some parenting duties as a grandparent, but it won't be nearly as challenging as the parenting duties that you did as a child, as a young adult. Okay, now, one of the things I didn't get to cover today was the areas of vulnerability in marriage. Your books on page 290 all the way through 293 is going to talk about the different areas of vulnerability in marriage. So there are gaps in role expectations. Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's going to cook dinner? Who's going to mow the grass? We have to figure those. So gaps in expectations may cause problems. Navigating work in marriage is also a problem. So whose career we're going to follow? We're going to follow the male's career. We're going to follow the female's career. And you know, I know a lot of really powerful females who have laid down their careers so that their equally powerful husbands can follow their dreams. Whose dream are you going to follow? Whose vocational dream are you going to follow? The males or the females? And when you have kids, who's going to work less to help take care of those kids? How are you going to manage that? That's another area of vulnerability. Financial difficulties. Arguments. The number one cause of arguments in relationships is finances. How are you going to manage the money, especially when the money gets short? And then there are some ways that you can communicate with your spouse that are not helpful and tend to be destructive in a marriage. We're going to talk about those more in detail tomorrow when we come back to class. Okay, so I'm about out of time. It's 10:51. I've kept you for more time than I should have. Thank you. I'm looking at my readout here, and it says that your average time in the lecture has been 31 minutes. I want to thank you for staying in the lecture such a long time. Some of you probably actually watched this whole lecture, and I really appreciate that. So we're at the end of our time. Don't forget, we have webinar tonight at 8 p.m. We're going to talk about marriage and spend the hour complaining about our marriages. So Johanna, Demetra, come on, let's all complain about our marriages and talk about things we could do if we didn't have kids. And so we'll talk about that stuff tonight in webinar. It was great seeing each and every one of you. Have a great day. If you need anything, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you at 8 p.m. tonight. Take care. Have a great day. Bye.